Our next presenter is Amelia White. Amelia is a second-year PhD student in the History Department of the University of Houston, where she focuses on the study of Spanish-American borderlands in the 17th and 18th centuries. Amelia has an MA in History from the University of Texas at San Antonio and a BA in Political Science from Austin College. Ms. White is currently the History Specialist at the Bryan Museum in Galveston. She previously held positions at the Alamo and the National Museum of the Pacific War. Her paper, Mapping the King's Highway, is sponsored by the Texas State Historical Association. Please join me in welcoming Amelia to the stage.
Thank you for that introduction, and to the Texas General Land Office for having me here today. Thank you also to the Texas State Historical Association for sponsoring my talk today, and thank you to everyone in the audience. It takes real dedication to Texas history to sit through the student panel of the symposium, so I know myself and my fellow presenters appreciate you being here. It's always tough to go in this spot right before the break, so I'm gonna try my best to stick to my time allotted. But my dissertation research is on the Camino Real, or more specifically, on the development and use of a colonial road network in Texas. I'm still very early into the research on this particular project. I have my archival work planned for next school year, 26, 27. But I think there's still some interesting things that I've learned at this point that relate particularly well to this symposium, and so that's what I'm going to be sharing today. So when people speak about the Camino Real in Texas, they usually mean the Camino Real de los Tejas. This was not the road to Texas, but rather the road to the Tejas, the name the Spanish used for some of the natives who were part of the Caddo culture in East Texas. The Camino eventually ran from Mexico City into present-day Louisiana by San Juan Bautista on the Rio Grande and San Antonio de Bejar. But this was not the only Camino Real into or in the territory. As missions, presidios, and civilian settlements grew in what became the province of Texas, roads naturally led the way. Some roads were used frequently, like the one running between San Antonio and La Bahia. Others were more temporary in nature, serving a specific military campaign or abandoned after closure of a mission. So one of the first questions that I asked myself when I started my research was, when did the Camino Real in Texas, or the Caminos Reales in Texas, begin appearing on maps? Because to me that was an indication that meant that there was something there was a road there was something to mark. And so this map here is actually the first published map that I was able to find of the Camino Real. Alonso de Leon, who started exploring Texas for the Spanish in the 1680s looking for the La Salle colony, was guided on his expeditions by native Texans following centuries-old trade routes. This was the same for all of the early entradas into Texas. The Spanish were not forging new paths, but rather being led down existing trails. The Spanish government, however, was notoriously tight with its knowledge, and although sketch maps and diaries give details of the routes taken, it's this French map here, published in 1718, that is the first one that indicates a route across Texas. And so here's a close-up of Texas on that map, and you may or may not be able to make it out, but we have some routes for DeSoto and La Salle marked, but also this route going across Texas, which, excuse me as I butcher his name with my Texas French, Louis Jacquereau de Saint-Denis is also marked on this map. Saint-Denis was a French-Canadian who came to Louisiana as part of d'Iberville's second expedition, and he does not get nearly as much credit as he should for the Spanish settlement of Texas. Spain had abandoned Texas in 1693, literally burning the first failed missions behind them as they left. Imagine the surprise when a Frenchman, Saint-Denis, suddenly appeared on the Rio Grande 20 years later. He had been sent in response to a letter that was secretly sent by a Spanish missionary, Father Francisco Hidalgo, asking the leader of the French colony in Louisiana for his help as a Catholic in reestablishing the missions in East Texas. Saint-Denis was led to the Spanish settlements on the Rio Grande by members of the Caddo Confederacy, again using traditional trade routes that linked the Caddo culture with the Pueblo culture. Not one to let an opportunity go to waste, Saint-Denis brought with him a load of French goods, hoping to establish trade relations between the French and the Spanish. Once the Spaniards got over their surprise of the Frenchmen suddenly appearing in their midst, Saint-Denis was arrested for illegally bringing foreign trade goods into Spanish territory and was held in San Juan Bautista until word could be heard from Mexico City as to what to do with him. Saint-Denis may have been under house arrest, but he found time to court Manuela Sanchez, the granddaughter of the Presidio's commander, Diego Ramon, before being sent to Mexico City. There he was able to defend his actions well enough that he was actually appointed as the guide for the 1716 expedition to be led by Domingo Ramon to reestablish the East Texas missions. Saint-Denis returned to San Juan Bautista and married Manuela before heading back across Texas. A souring relationship between the French and the Spanish eventually led to Saint-Denis and Manuela leaving Texas and settling permanently in Louisiana, but not before Saint-Denis had helped reestablish a Spanish presence in East Texas. So this is actually the only Spanish map published in the 1700s that shows Texas. And you will see no road marked on this map. In fact, there's not a whole lot there in terms of maps of the road network in Texas until the 1800s. I thought I was onto something with my research for a little bit when I read that members of the Spanish Royal Engineer Corps were present during the Rivera expedition, which surveyed Texas in 1727. Reading the diaries from that expedition, however, reveals shockingly little about the state of the roads they were traveling on, and the large-scale map produced by the engineers did not mark the existing roads. Truth be told, there was not much to mark. Until after the Civil War, there were no paved roads in Texas, and so colonial roads were nothing more than dirt roads, barely wide enough for a mule cart, and they were often muddy with unbridged river crossings outside of the major settlements. And where the road was could change seasonally depending on how much it had rained recently and how high the river crossings were. Use of particular segments could also be determined by the activity of native Texans, particularly the Comanche. So probably the most significant cartographer working in Texas during the Spanish period was Juan Pedro Walker. Walker was born in Spanish New Orleans in 1781 to an English immigrant father and French New Orleans native mother. He was raised primarily in Natchez in present-day Mississippi, and at the age of 17 was hired by the United States as part of the survey gang that surveyed the international boundary between Spanish Florida and the United States. Walker continued his work as a surveyor following this initial job, and in 1803 was actually on a temporary job in Texas when he heard that Mississippi had been sold by the French to the United States. Not wanting to become an American citizen, he requested permission to move to New Spain and was granted permission to do so. He worked as a surveyor and a cartographer throughout present-day Mexico and along the Rio Grande, and was held in high esteem. In 1807, Walker was assigned as a host and interpreter for the American Zebulon Pike in his expedition, who had been detained for illegally entering into Spanish territory. Pike's later maps were allegedly influenced by information he obtained from Walker. Walker's fortunes changed in 1811, however, when he was jailed for supporting the independence movement of Father Miguel Hidalgo y Castilla. Walker was convicted by a military tribunal in November of that year and was supposed to be exiled from the Americas. But before he could be sent back to Spain, Jose Joaquin de Arredondo, commandant of the Eastern Division of the Provinces Internas, put Walker to work drafting much-needed maps of his jurisdiction. During 1815 and 1816, Walker worked along the Rio Grande into the Texas interior as far north as San Antonio and on the coast of Nuevo Santander. Eventually, however, he was departed from Veracruz to Cadiz. Once back in Spain, his case was reviewed. Lacking sufficient evidence to convict or exonerate Walker, the Crown ruled that he was to remain in Spain, but provided that as a former officer, he would receive a small stipend. Walker lived another decade as a pensioner of the Crown. None of Walker's maps were published, but manuscript maps and fragmentary field notes, contemporary allusions to his maps and official correspondence, and maps published in the United States that cited Walker as their source hinted his work. 15 Walker maps, like the one pictured here, have been found in repositories in Spain, Mexico, and the United States. These maps vary widely from rough drafts with hasty scribbles to elaborately detailed final products. I've not had a chance to examine any of the Walker maps for traces of the Caminos Reales in Texas, but hope to do so over the next year. Maps like this one produced by Stephen F. Austin in 1822 show that a road network did exist in Texas before the increase in immigration to the province from the United States that began in the 1820s and grew throughout the 1830s. With independence from Texas and subsequent annexation to the United States, travel in Texas reoriented towards the east, and the older roads south fell out of favor or became incorporated into a new network. The roads to Mexico City lost their economic and political importance and were replaced by roads leading to places like Missouri and Tennessee. Portions of the colonial roads provide the basis for our modern highway system. There's a close-up of the Stephen F. Austin map, and you can see he's got the San Antonio Road marked here, and then these are the ones going off to San Juan Bautista and Presidio, or Laredo rather, sorry. So the Caminos Reales came back into the public attention in the early 20th century as part of a national movement to recognize historic roads in the United States. In 1911, Mrs. Claudia Wilbarger Norville from Bastrop was attending a national convention of the Daughters of the American Revolution in Washington, D.C., and was shocked to hear a delegate from Missouri describe the Santa Fe Trail as the oldest road in the United States. She knew a road, Old San Antonio Road, which ran from Nacogdoches through Bastrop to San Antonio that was much older than the Santa Fe Trail. Norville made it her life's work to get historical recognition for what she called the King's Highway as the oldest road in the United States, connecting the Texas stretch with other Caminos Reales that ran through Florida, New Mexico, and California. As a result of her lobbying efforts, in 1915, the Texas state legislature appropriated $5,000 to survey and mark the old road. The DAR contributed an additional $13,000. Railroad surveyor and civil engineer V.N. Zivley was hired to survey the road from the Sabine River to the Rio Grande. Reconstructing the road from the Sabine to San Antonio was fairly easy for Zivley, and he primarily used land surveys and land grant documents from the 1800s contained in the General Land Office archives to establish this route. From San Antonio to the Rio Grande was a different case, and Zivley consulted Spanish expedition diaries to find the route, which had fallen into disuse. Following the survey, 123 pink granite markers were placed approximately every 5 miles along the route. Despite Mrs. Norville's best efforts, a continuous historic highway from the Sabine River to the Rio Grande never materialized, but State Highway 21 and several other of our modern highways approximate portions of the original route. Now, you may have noticed there's a couple flaws in Mrs. Norville and Mr. Zivley's efforts. They were under the impression that there was one road, which they called Old San Antonio Road, and the Camino Real interchangeably. These mistaken assumptions would have formed the next attempt to map the Caminos Reales in Texas. In July 1989, spurred by the upcoming 300th anniversary of Old San Antonio Road, which was dated to the 1691 expedition led by Domingo Terán de los Rios, the Texas Senate passed Senate Concurrent Resolution Number 2, authorizing the creation of an Old San Antonio Road Commission and directing the Department of Highways and Public Transportation, SDHPT, to develop a preservation plan and identify the present disposition of the road. One thing that quickly became apparent to the commission is that there was not just one road. In fact, Old San Antonio Road was not even the original route taken by the Spanish between San Antonio and East Texas. The commission found that the route marked by Zivley consisted of at least 3 non-contemporaneous road segments that he had patched into one trail. The commission made use of Zivley's field surveys, but more importantly went back to the diaries of the early Spanish expeditions and meticulously cross-analyzed the various texts, plotting the possible routes on a 7.5-minute USGS topographic maps. 18th and 19th century land grant and court documents were also consulted, and this helped establish not only where the road was, but also when the different branches were in use. The report published by the Commission is the Bible on the Caminos Reales in Texas and the single best source of information on this topic to this point. I've commandeered the UH Library System copy and do not plan to give it back until I graduate. The report discusses not one, but 5 main roads, in case you were curious. So real quick, I know I've run out of time, but the next chapter in the life of the Camino Real was its designation in 2004 as a National Historic Trail. And I was going to explain what that means, but I'm going to cut that out for time's sake. But keeping with the theme of mapping, the NPS website on the historic trail has 2 modern maps useful for navigating the trail. One, an interactive map that shows locations to stop and explore along the road, and the other is an ArcGIS map of the entire historic trail system showing just how far we've come in mapping the Caminos Reales since the De Leon expeditions in the 1680s and 90s.